I promise to explain in more detail the theses on the global revolutionary movement, lecture at the United States Military Academy at West Point, that I published here a few weeks ago. Since these explanations are lengthy, I will divide them into several articles, returning to the topic whenever the opportunity arises. I begin with the first paragraph. The revolutionary movement is a unique and continuous phenomenon through time, at least since the 15th century. Each generation of revolutionaries is aware of being the heir and continuator of the previous ones. This is abundantly documented in their writings. It is a fact, not my interpretation. Whatever the state of affairs may be, there can be no conscious political stance without knowledge of the historical background that produced it, and not only of the immediate factual precursors, but also and primarily of the enduring, long-term elements that do not exert direct causal stimuli on the present situation, but instead shape and determine from afar the general framework in which everything takes place. When a political agent's speech echoes that of figures from 2, 3, or even 4 centuries ago, figures whom he does not know and could not consciously quote, this can sometimes be explained by the mere residual persistence of old turns of phrase, embedded in general culture and passively absorbed by the speaker. But when such verbal coincidence is joined by a shared identity of values and objectives expressed through that speech, it is likely that the agent's actions continue a sequence initiated long before him, one to which he contributes with varying degrees of awareness of his role in a centuries-old effort. Furthermore, if by tracing the origins of his language we can reconstruct an unbroken chain of transmission, passed down from generation to generation from the pioneers of the idea to its latest passive repeater, then it is clear we are dealing with an identifiable, continuous, and self-conscious historical movement. A historical movement may encompass and contain many political, cultural, and religious movements, partial, local, and temporary versions of it, which may differ greatly and even contrast with one another, yet still contribute to the unity of the whole, inexorably advancing toward the fulfillment of a general meaning already formulated, in essence, from the outset. A historical movement does not act on its own. It is not a magical force or, as Hegel would say, a cunning of reason that operates and achieves its goals through some invisible logic, bypassing the conscious intentions of individuals and generations. On the contrary, it is the temporal continuity of a set of symbols, values, and objectives that are consciously internalized and affirmed by individuals in each generation who commit themselves to its service. Only, in each of these individuals, awareness of the values they serve does not imply full consciousness of the movement in its entirety. In some individuals, yes. In every generation, there is at least a core group of intellectuals who know where the movement came from and where it is going. But the majority of participants may be aware only of its immediate partial currents. That is more than sufficient to ensure that their actions align perfectly with the total direction of the historical movement. To the lay observer, the unity of the movement may be entirely invisible, especially because he cannot distinguish it from 3 other types of unity that can also appear behind the multiplicity of human actions. 1. The spontaneous unity of historical development. The growth of the capitalist economy, for instance, results from no plan and is directed by no one. As Ludwig von Mises observed, it emerges from the sum of an innumerable number of individual acts, each rational in itself, but disconnected from the whole, carried out by economic agents in pursuit of their personal and group goals. 2. The concrete and deliberate unity of a political, social, religious, or cultural movement that is explicit, endowed with an identifiable leadership and a mass of militants, faithful followers, or adherents who are conscious of this unity. Catholicism or communism are characteristic examples. To distinguish them from the historical movement in general, I will refer to them as special movements. 3. The invisible unity of secret power or conspiracy. In this case, the unity exists only for the leaders, the drivers of the process, and their immediate collaborators. The mass of anonymous helpers, grouped into smaller units with no contact among themselves, have no clear idea, and sometimes no idea at all, of the broader articulation or of the overarching purpose they serve. Although the unity of a historical movement may contain elements drawn from these 3 models, none of them explains it. A historical movement is not a purely spontaneous development, but a conscious and prolonged effort to push things in a certain direction. Yet it also differs from special movements in the sense that it does not require a hierarchical command structure, at least not a permanent one. It also differs from conspiratorial unity because that hierarchical structure, when it exists, does not necessarily need to remain secret. The unity of a historical movement rests entirely on the appeal of certain symbols that condense and give form to lasting desires, ideals, and goals. Once adopted as a banner of struggle by some special movement, these symbols spread and take root so deeply within the culture that their unifying power can be revived at any moment by another special movement that draws inspiration, directly or indirectly, from the previous one. A succession of special movements inspired by the same core of symbols and values, crossing eras without organizational connection to each other, forms, by itself, a historical movement, even if the awareness of continuity becomes quite tenuous or is shared only by an intellectual elite without direct command over the whole. If the movement continues in the same direction, it cannot be said to have stopped or to have been extinguished. A historical movement may alternately crystallize as a special movement around a hierarchical leadership known to all participants, or, on the contrary, fragment into so many independent nuclei that it may appear to have dissolved, not only in adverse times, but even during periods in which the winds are most favorable to it, and it can rely on vegetative growth supported by the mere spontaneous development of social facts. Sometimes, a brilliant leader emerges who can maintain conscious control of the movement for a time. Sometimes, it is necessary to wait until the spontaneity of events creates the conditions for that. But in both of these phases, the revolutionary movement continues, undeterred. No one will ever truly understand the global revolutionary movement so long as they continue to view it solely through the lens of the special movements that compose it. How can one explain, for instance, the sudden and brutal rise of leftism in the world after the fall of the USSR, which, according to general expectation, should have signaled its end? The phenomenon was so surprising that many chose even to deny it, retreating into a psychotic illusion. But its explanation is simple. If you understand that the communist movement organized from the command centers in Moscow and Beijing was merely a partial and temporary embodiment of the revolutionary movement, that this broader movement continued to develop in other contexts, under other forms, latent and discrete, ready to come to the forefront as soon as the Soviet-Chinese version failed, as indeed it did. It is, for instance, disheartening to note how the U.S., in the 1950s, while directly combating communist expansion and Soviet espionage, welcomed with open arms the philosophers of the Frankfurt School, who already carried within themselves the germ of the New Left, a movement destined to bloom in the following decade with a force, virulence, and scope never dreamed of by the communist parties. To combat a special movement without considering its links to the broader revolutionary movement is to risk strengthening the latter precisely at the moment one imagines defeating it. In fact, the Soviet elite itself possessed much greater flexibility and a strategic horizon incomparably broader than the intelligence professionals and strategic analysts in the U.S. could imagine at the time. These, in addition to viewing the communist movement in isolation, outside of the revolutionary tradition, also saw it merely as a pseudopod of Soviet power, when, in truth, Soviet power was only a local and temporary embodiment of a historical current that had existed long before it and survived perfectly well after the dissolution of the USSR. The unity of the historical movement must be sought, first and foremost, in language. It is the recurrence of leading motifs, in the sense this expression holds in literature and music, that marks the continuity of the movement. And the moment that continuity is not merely a vague, cultural influence, but the continuity of revolutionary organizations that generate their successors and are reincarnated in them after their apparent disappearance, then the characterization of the historical movement becomes clear and undeniable. There is no longer any excuse for failing to perceive its unity beneath the apparent variation, however disorienting it may be. For anyone familiar with the history of the revolutionary movement as a whole, this unity, so difficult for the layman to discern, shines through even in seemingly trivial details. When, for instance, Mr. Lula declares himself Catholic and then, In the next breath, with the most oafish expression imaginable, claims he is entitled to receive communion without confession because he is a man without sin. Anyone who attributes that to the president's personal foolishness is infinitely more foolish than he is. The phrase echoes a leitmotif of the revolutionary movement, circulating at least since the 15th century. The essential impeccability of the revolutionary, pure and saintly, a priori and unconditionally. It's just a verbal coincidence, the all-wise observers will say. It is not. Mr. Lula's entire mindset was shaped by the direct and persistent teachings of Mr. Frei Beto, who is the very embodiment of the revolutionary heresy, in no way different from that of the Cathars and Albigensians. Mr. Lula, in this case, may have no awareness whatsoever that he is a ventriloquist's puppet sitting on the lap of a 5-century-old tradition. But Mr. Frei Beto, who thinks with the necessary historical perspective, knows perfectly well what ends he trained his disciple for. I will continue these explanations next week.